Hello and welcome to What the Puck, where we dive into anything and everything related to the amazing sport of hockey. I'm Gregory Doudna, and today's episode we're looking at the 2021 NHL Expansion Draft. Now this is not a mock draft video, as there are already a million of those. What this is just an explanation as to what the NHL Expansion Draft even is. Now the point of today's episode is to maybe help clarify some of the things you might have some questions about, or if you're someone who doesn't really understand what the expansion draft even is, give you a little bit of background, just a little bit of understanding as to what is coming in the next couple of days, as the draft itself is just a few days away as of recording this episode. So first things first, what's going on here? Well, on April 30th, the Seattle Kraken paid their final expansion payment to the NHL, thus becoming the 32nd NHL franchise. Now on July 21st, just a few days away, at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, the Seattle Kraken will get to have their draft, which is where they announce who the players are that they have picked from players already in the league that will make up their team. Now, before Seattle gets to the draft, some things have to happen, and a couple of things have already started to happen. Some dominoes have started to fall, and we're going to look into some of that right now. So first things first, the rest of the NHL, excluding the Vegas Golden Knights, who are exempt from the expansion draft this year, will have to submit protection lists to the NHL for review. Now, what these lists entail are the players that each NHL team, again, other than Vegas, will want to protect from Seattle. These are the players who might be their star players, they might be their building blocks, they might be the players that the franchise just wants to keep for their future. And so each team will then have to submit the list of those players specifically that they want to protect to keep away from Seattle to the NHL to be reviewed, make sure everything is done legally, make sure everything is following the guidelines for this draft in particular. So first, let's get into these protection lists. So each team will get to decide between two formats as to which one they're going to use to be able to protect the players on their team. The first format is in the style of 7 forwards, 3 defensemen, and 1 goaltender. The second format is 8 skaters of any combination of forwards and defensemen and 1 goaltender. Now there are some exemptions to this, and there are some other requirements that go along with these lists. First, let's talk about players with a no movement clause in their contract. Now I'm not going to get too in-depth in the specifics of contracts, as that is an episode for another day. This basically means that in a nutshell, that player is not allowed to be moved anywhere against their will. So any player with a no movement clause in their contract must be on that protection list. Each team who has a player with a no movement clause must use one of their protection slots for those players. Now there are some exemptions to this rule. First is if the player's contract would expire on July 28th, which is when free agency starts for the season. So if a player is in their final year of their contract, their no movement clause is voided. The second exemption would be if a player is deemed to have a career-threatening injury, and this is something that has to go in front of the NHL and has to be reviewed by the NHL in order to decide if it is actually a career-threatening injury, which means that player does not have to be protected if they have a no movement clause, and Seattle is not able to draft them anyway. And third is if a player decides to waive his no movement clause. Now we've already seen this happen with multiple players. A couple of examples would be Eric Johnson of the Colorado Avalanche and Ben Bishop of the Dallas Stars. So now that we have talked about the no movement clause, let's talk about players who aren't eligible to be drafted anyway. This includes players who are in their first or second year of North American professional hockey. So that also includes the minor leagues like the American Hockey League. So any players who fall into that category do not have to be protected, and they're not eligible to be drafted by Seattle at all. So now that we've talked about the players, let's talk about what's up with the protection lists. So these protection lists must be submitted to the NHL by July 17th for review, just to make sure that it's done legally, make sure that everybody is following the guidelines. Then on July 18th, those lists, after being reviewed by the NHL and approved, will then be sent to Seattle, where they then get to look at them so that they can finally make the picks to draft together their team. Now, they have about 72 hours once they receive these lists until the 21st, when the draft officially happens, to make their picks, to figure out what they're going to do. And this includes about a 48-hour window where they get to talk to pending unrestricted free agents. Now, pending unrestricted free agents are the players who will hit the open market on July 28th when free agency officially starts for the NHL. So because Seattle is coming into this, they kind of get the first pick so that they have a little bit better opportunity to put their team together and kind of get everything finalized before all the craziness of re-signings or new signings or anything like that happens. Okay, now let's talk about how teams are required to expose players for the NHL draft. Essentially what this does is makes it to where teams who are kind of on the younger side, who will have a lot of players that fall into that first and second year professional category that don't have to be protected, kind of makes it to where teams like that aren't able to kind of hit some loopholes and essentially be able to protect most of their team, thus making it almost impossible for Seattle to be able to select the players for their team. Now, exposure requirements. So again, it cannot be a player who's in their first or second year of professional North American hockey. So that means any player who is in at least their third year of professional North American hockey and has played a minimum of 27 games in this prior season that just ended, the 2020-2021 season, or 54 games total between the last two seasons, so the 2019-2020 and 2020-2021 seasons combined. Now, here's the important thing, and this is actually something that I had to have pointed out to me because I was making the mistake of thinking that these two things were equal. However, they are not, and that is the eligibility of exposure and the eligibility of being picked. These are two different things. They are not the same. And this is where I was actually making some mistakes. Just because a player is not eligible to be exposed, say for example, they didn't play enough games in the last season or the last two seasons, that does not mean that they cannot be the pick for the Seattle Kraken. They absolutely can. So now that we know all of this, let's go ahead and look at what the requirements are for Seattle in the players that they have to pick and the team that they have to put together. Now, Seattle has an absolute requirement that they have to pick exactly 30 players, one player from each NHL team, again, except for Vegas Golden Knights. Now, of those 30 players, a minimum of 20 must be under contract for this next season, the 2021-2022 season. So that leaves them with a potential of 10 pending unrestricted free agents that they can then sign in that 48-hour window before the NHL Expansion Draft. Now, with those 30 players, there is a minimum of each position that Seattle has to select. Those minimums are 14 forwards, 9 defensemen, and 3 goaltenders. That then leaves them with 4 potential picks for any other position that they choose. Now, the important thing about these at least 20 players that are under contract for the 21-22 season is that their contracts must make up between 60% and 100% of the 2020-2021 salary cap. Now, the salary cap is $81.5 million. So that means of those at least 20 players, their salaries must equal at least just under $49 million in order to meet the guidelines. Now, with all this knowledge, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the options that Seattle has for their draft picks. This includes draft and let walk, which are players that they know they won't have for their team in the upcoming season, but they just need to pick a player from a team because they have to, it's required, but they don't really care to keep that player on the team. So that's a player that they're just going to draft and then let their contract expire and just let that player walk and do their own thing in free agency. So that's something that could potentially happen with these pending free agents. Another option is draft and flip, and this is where Seattle has already made deals with certain teams to select players from one team, but then trade them to another team in return for something from that second team that they would be trading the player to. Now, this happened a couple times when the Vegas Golden Knights did their expansion draft. For example, when they selected Alexei Emelin from Montreal and traded him to Nashville. Now, the last option we're going to talk about are side deals. Now, side deals is what a lot of people really credit to Vegas in their ability to rise to such dominance so quickly and be able to reach the Stanley Cup Finals in their first year of existence. Now, I feel like a lot of teams have kind of learned from what Vegas did and aren't going to be too eager in their side dealings with Seattle. Now, a side deal is where Seattle will have already talked to a team and will have given them their word that they will not select certain players in exchange for something like draft picks or future trades for certain players, stuff like that. This is really where Vegas went to town. Vegas was able to grab players like Shea Theodore, Riley Smith, and Alex Tuck from teams in exchange for not selecting certain players and for kind of leaving it a little more to the teams that they were selecting. However, this really ended up backfiring for some of those teams, as those players that they then traded to Vegas have become absolute stars for that franchise. Now, like I said, I'm sure there's plenty of things that we could really dive deep into, but this is just kind of meant to be an overarching video to really get you a little more up to speed, hopefully clarify a couple things, the big one being that exposure and pick eligibility, that they are not the same thing. Like I say, that was the one that really got me, that I've made a mistake on in the past. So hopefully it doesn't mess with you at all. But with that, we are at the end of this video. Thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to drop a like. If you have any questions, any comments, anything you would like to say, be sure to drop that down in the comment box below. Be sure to share this video, subscribe to this channel, as we will be diving into everything hockey related. Thank you so much. I am Gregory Doudna. This is What the Puck. I will see you guys next time.